Chapter 13. But my black friend doesn't think it's racist. One thing of which everyone who's ever held an opinion on an issue which affects marginalised groups is guilty is using the fact that a member of a marginalised group shares our opinion to make ourselves feel better. For example, on both sides of the so-called sex work debate, former sex workers who agree with one side or the other are used as what I describe as token puppets in order to add weight to that faction's arguments, manipulating the emotions of those who are undecided, but above all, reassuring the people who already agree with them that they are correct, virtuous, noble, and are fighting the good fight against the evil oppressors. But although, as I say, absolutely everyone who is capable of doing so is guilty of this to a greater or lesser extent, the use of what I describe as token puppets is far more exploitative on what we describe as the right. After all, as I've explained in previous chapters, the entire basis of their position and worldview is opposing and attacking what they perceive as outside influences which threaten to destroy society, which is to say, to make them feel uncomfortable by changing things. And because people who are marginalised and oppressed are raised in exactly the same society, internalise the same beliefs and values, and in many cases prefer the security of negative peace to the uncertainty and perceived threat of progress, it is inevitable that at least some marginalised and oppressed individuals will become token puppets, defending their oppressors and condemning those who seek to ensure their equality as the true exploiters. For example, Muslim women who aggressively defend the wearing of the burqa, claim that Islam is feminist or otherwise guarantees gender equality, become Sharia judges, or even join ISIS. To most non-Muslims, they are the oppressed victims, but to them, Islam is not only the norm, but the ideal, and we, on the other hand, are the oppressors, invading their countries, imposing our morality, laws and values for our own selfish ends, killing their children, and threatening to destroy their values and their way of life. Because once again, the polarization of us versus them has created an ideological war of good versus evil, a war in which each side is utterly convinced that because their enemy is evil, then they are the good guys by default. And similarly, having been raised in societies in which the strict male-female gender binary and monogamous heterosexual marriage are not only the norm but the ideal as well, and everyone is supposedly equal now because hashtag meritocracy and hashtag individual responsibility, every right-wing, far-right and neo-fascist movement includes a handful of token puppets who are used as poster children and paraded around at every conceivable opportunity in the hopes of convincing everyone, including the members of the movements themselves, that they can't possibly be bigoted oppressors because, see, some of our best friends are insert oppressed minority group here. However, the reason why I use the term token puppet to describe such people is that in the end, they are utterly expendable, kept in the spotlight only so long as they say what their oppressors want to hear in order to make them feel better. Because as Tommy Lahren learned the hard way when she said something that her straight, white, cis male and Christian employers at the Blaze didn't agree with, and thus was fired so fast that her feet never even touched the ground, she was only ever a mouthpiece for their self-serving agenda, and therefore any opinion which conflicted with that self-serving agenda was neither required nor desired. As a matter of fact, the key to determining who is and is not what I describe as a token puppet is figuring out who ultimately benefits from their actions, because no matter how sincerely we may believe in our cause, if the primary beneficiaries of our activism, in inverted commas, are the dominant in-group, and especially those people who want to strangle all social progress to maintain the status quo, while the people who we are targeting are already the victims of oppression, discrimination, and abuse, then we might as well be puppets after all. And a tragic example of this bitter reality are the TERFs, who I've already mentioned in a previous chapter, because although as radical feminists they seek to overthrow the patriarchy, like all second-wave feminists, their ideology is still ironically rooted in the very gender stereotypes which they seek to overturn and erase, specifically the arbitrary conceit that everyone is either male or female, meaning that in the end, by attacking and condemning transgenderism in inverted commas, they are simply legitimising and spreading the bigoted fear-mongering of social conservatives who seek to oppress all cis women just as much as they long to eliminate all transgender and gender binary defying individuals by one means or another. As a brief side note, in fact, the entire third wave of feminism is at least partially a result of the realisation that far from smashing the patriarchy, the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s had been its unwitting enabler, still rooted in the conceit that men are stronger than and naturally superior to women, and therefore calling on women to become more like men, while condemning things such as sex work and transgender identity just as viciously as their socially conservative foes. So instead, third wave feminists embrace the reality that gender is not a binary and is separate from biological sex and sexual orientation, as well as embracing sex positivity, the principle that everyone who is of legal age is free to express their sexuality or not, however they desire, including offering sex for money, as long as they're not being exploited or coerced in any way, shape, form, or fashion. But as the existence of TERFs and SWERFs, which is to say trans and sex worker exclusionary radical feminists in the 21st century demonstrates, far too many people who claim to be feminists still haven't gotten the message, and instead are still blinkered by their concrete mindedness, as well as the social norms, values, standards, and ideals upon which they were raised. And for that matter, so are the millions of women who insist that they don't need feminism because they don't hate men, they like being housewives and stay-at-home mothers, they like being told that they are sexy, and so on and so forth, because after all, society and the media have spent our entire lives conditioning us to believe that a woman's natural role is to be a housewife, mother, and caregiver, and that her worth as a human being is determined by how attractive she is to men, just as it constantly reminds us all that only brown people can ever really be terrorists, because white men who commit a terrorist atrocity are always #mentally ill, #lone wolves. But sticking with the caricature of a quote-unquote feminist being an angry, hairy-legged and man-hating dyke, this is merely another example of how regressive reactionaries almost always portray their opponents as grotesque and cartoonish parodies of their true selves.